Hey everyone. We think we know the 1800s from those fancy movies, but the truth is way weirder than that. Today, we worry about stuff like too much screen time. Back then, they worried about their wallpaper killing them. Here are 4 things they actually did. They posed for family photos with dead bodies. They wore dresses dyed with rat poison. They ate ground-up Egyptian mummies because they thought it was medicine. They even wore jewelry made from human hair. I'm just a guy reading stories, so subscribe if you want to stay in the loop. I have to ask, where are you listening from tonight? Let us jump into the strangest time in history. I'm glad you're sticking around, because to really get why this stuff happened, we have to look at the world these people actually stepped into. It all starts in 1837. That is when an 18-year-old girl named Victoria became the Queen of England. She didn't just sit on a throne for a few years and retire. She stayed there until 1901. That is over 60 years of one person calling the shots and setting the tone for the entire planet. Everything you think you know about the old days usually comes from this specific chunk of time. But it wasn't some quiet, polite era. It was a massive, loud, and very dirty explosion of change. Before Victoria took over, most people lived on farms. They knew their neighbors, they saw the sun, they grew their own food and lived by the seasons. Then, almost overnight, the world flipped on its head. Machines showed up. Factories started popping up in big cities like London and Manchester. People heard they could make more money working in a mill than they could milking cows, so they left. They packed their bags and walked toward the smoke. They didn't just move for fun. They were looking for a better life, but what they found was a trap. The factories needed bodies to run the machines, and the people needed money to buy bread. It was a trade-off that changed the face of the planet forever. This was a massive migration, but it wasn't organized at all. Millions of people poured into cities that weren't ready for them. Imagine a city built for 100,000 people suddenly trying to fit 1 million. There were no plans, there were no rules for how to build a house safely. Builders just threw up brick shacks as fast as they could to make a quick buck. They shared walls, they had no windows for fresh air. If you were poor, you weren't just living in a small apartment. You were likely sharing a single room with your spouse, your 5 kids, and maybe another family you didn't even know. People slept in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down at the same time. The streets were even worse than the houses. They weren't paved with stone or asphalt like we have now. They were just dirt and mud. And because there were no toilets or sewers, everything went into the street. I mean everything. Trash, kitchen waste, and the stuff you'd usually flush away today. It all just sat there in the heat. Thousands of horses were the main way people got around, so you can add that to the pile too. The smell was so bad it actually has a specific name in the history books. They call it the Great Stink. It was so powerful that it eventually forced the government to stop meeting because they couldn't breathe inside their own buildings. Because everyone was living on top of each other in these conditions, people died. They died a lot. Diseases like cholera and typhoid weren't just scary stories you read about. They were part of daily life. You could wake up feeling fine and be dead by dinner time because the water you drank was full of bacteria from the street. 1 out of every 3 children died before they turned 5. Death wasn't a rare tragedy that happened once in a while. It was a neighbor. It was always right there, waiting in the shadows of those cramped, dark hallways. Now, you might wonder who was in charge of this mess. That brings us back to Victoria. She was the face of the whole era, but she wasn't just a political leader. She was the world's first real influencer. Think about how you feel when a famous person posts a photo on social media today. That was Victoria, but with much more power. This was the first time in history that things like newspapers and early photos could show regular people what the Queen was doing. If she bought a certain type of tea, every woman in England wanted that tea. If she wore a specific style of hat, that hat sold out the next day. The most important thing to know about Victoria is how she handled her own life. When her husband, Albert, died young, she didn't just stay sad for a week or a month. She wore black for the rest of her life. She stopped smiling in public. She turned her personal grief into a national brand. Because she was the boss, everyone else felt like they had to act just like her. Being obsessed with death and mourning didn't seem weird to them because the woman at the top was doing it every single day. So you have this perfect storm. You have millions of people living in filth, watching their kids die, while their queen is telling them that being obsessed with the dead is the only proper way to live. This is where the poison dresses and the hair jewelry come from. People were desperate to find a way to handle all that loss and still look good doing it. They were trying to survive a world that was moving too fast and killing them too early. It was a strange, dark time to be alive, and it's about to get even weirder. You'd think that with all the death and poison we just talked about, these people would have bigger things to worry about than how they held a teacup. But it was actually the opposite. Because life was so messy and dangerous, they tried to control every single second of their day. They turned being polite into a high-stakes sport where one wrong move could literally ruin your life. If you walked into a bookstore back then, you'd see rows and rows of these massive, heavy books. They were etiquette manuals. And I'm not talking about a little pamphlet with a few tips. These things were hundreds of pages long. They were basically instruction manuals for how to be a human being. People bought them by the millions because they were terrified of looking like they didn't belong. Imagine you're just trying to go for a walk down the street. You couldn't just walk. You had to have a purposeful yet graceful stride. If you were a woman, you couldn't look around too much or laugh loudly. You had to keep your eyes forward. If you saw a man you knew, you weren't allowed to say hi first. You had to wait for him to bow, and then you'd give a tiny little nod. If you messed that up, people would gossip about you for weeks. It sounds exhausting, right? That's because it was. Every move was a calculation. Then you had the whole situation with calling cards. This was basically their version of a like on social media, but way more annoying. You had these little white cards with your name printed on them. If you wanted to be part of the cool crowd, you spent your whole afternoon driving around in a carriage, stopping at people's houses. But here's the kicker. You weren't usually there to actually see the person. You'd just hand your card to their servant at the door. The servant would take it and put it on a silver tray in the hallway. If the corner of the card was folded a certain way, it meant you came in person. If it was folded another way, it meant you were just passing by. It was like a secret code. If they liked you, they might send their card to your house a few days later. If they didn't send a card back, that was a huge slap in the face. It meant you weren't good enough for them. You were being ghosted in real life with fancy paper and expensive ink. All of this was really about the class system. Before this time, you were either born rich or you were poor. There wasn't much in between. But now, thanks to factories and trade, a lot of regular people were making money.
The old money families, the ones who'd been rich for centuries, hated this. They didn't want common people sitting at their tables just because they had a full wallet. So they made up all these impossible rules. They were like secret handshakes designed to trip you up. If you didn't know which of the 6 forks to use for fish, or if you spoke too loudly about how much your shoes cost, everyone knew the truth. They knew you were a nobody who just happened to have some cash. Acting rich became a full-time job for everyone. You spent your whole day trying to prove you belonged. You'd dress in clothes you couldn't breathe in and talk in a voice that wasn't yours, all because you were scared of being found out.
But what happened if you failed? What if you accidentally offended the wrong person or broke a major rule? That's when things got really scary. It's exactly what it sounds like. If you were cut by society, you were dead to them. Imagine walking down the street and seeing your best friend. You smile and go to wave, but they look right through you. They act like you're a brick wall. They don't speak, they don't nod, they don't even blink. Then the next person does the same thing, and the next. You stop getting invited to dinners. Your business partners stop answering your letters. Your kids can't find anyone to marry because your family name is now poisoned by your bad behavior. This wasn't just about being lonely. It was a financial and social death sentence. In a world where who you knew was everything, being cast out meant you were finished. You could have all the money in the world, but if the proper society decided you were done, you were done. You'd be forced to move away or live the rest of your life in total isolation. People lived in a constant state of anxiety. Every dinner party was a minefield. Every conversation was a test. They were so busy trying to look perfect that they didn't realize the rules they were following were just as suffocating as the poison dresses they were wearing. It was a game where the rules changed all the time, and the people at the top were the ones holding the rule book. You were either in or you were out, and once you were out, there was almost no way back in. It was a cold, calculated way to live. And the weirdest part? People actually fought to be a part of it. They wanted the rules. They wanted the structure. Because in a world that felt like it was spinning out of control, having a book tell you exactly how to sit gave you a tiny bit of power, even if that power was just knowing which card to leave on a silver tray. But as hard as they tried to look perfect on the outside, what they were doing to their bodies in private was much, much worse. That drive for perfection didn't stop when someone's heart did. In fact, that's when the real work started. See, back then, death wasn't just a sad event you dealt with privately. It was a full-scale production. It was a performance that could last for years, and if you didn't play your part exactly right, the neighbors would ruin you. I'm not just talking about being a little bit sad. I'm talking about an entire culture built around the business of being miserable. When someone died, the clock started ticking. You had to follow a massive list of rules that told you what to wear, who to talk to, and where you could go. And if you think a funeral today is expensive, you have no idea. Back then, grieving could literally put you in the poorhouse. Let's look at what happened if you were a woman who just lost her husband. The second he stopped breathing, your life as an individual was basically over for the next 2 years. You were now a widow, and that title came with a mandatory uniform. For the first year and a day, you were in what they called deep mourning. This was the hardest part. You had to wear a dress made of black crepe. This wasn't the nice, soft fabric you're thinking of. Crepe was made of silk, but it was treated with chemicals to make it look dull and scratchy. It didn't reflect any light at all. It was meant to look like you were a walking shadow. But the dress was only the beginning.
You also had to wear a weeping veil. This was a huge, heavy piece of black fabric that went over your hat and draped all the way down to your knees. It covered your face completely. Imagine trying to walk down a crowded, muddy street with a thick wool sheet over your head. You couldn't see where you were going. You were breathing in the dust and the fumes from the street through this heavy black mesh. And here is the really crazy part. Those dresses and veils were actually dangerous. The dyes they used to get that deep black color were often full of arsenic and other nasty chemicals. If it rained or if you got sweaty, that black dye would run down your face and soak into your skin. Women ended up with terrible rashes. Some even breathed in the toxic particles from the fabric and ended up with permanent lung damage. They were literally being poisoned by their own sadness. You couldn't just take the veil off because it was hot or you couldn't see. If you lifted that veil in public, people would gossip. They'd say you were looking for your next husband before the first one was even in the ground. You were trapped in a cage of black fabric, and the public was watching to make sure you stayed there. As time went on, the rules changed slightly, but they didn't get much easier. After that first year, you moved into second mourning. You could ditch the heavy veil, but everything else still had to be pitch black. After another 9 months, you reached half mourning. This was the first time you could wear a tiny bit of color. But you couldn't just pick your favorite red dress. You were allowed to wear exactly 3 colors: gray, lavender, or mauve. That was it. If you showed up in a green dress one day too early, you were a social outcast. People would stop leaving their cards at your door. They'd stop inviting you to dinner. You'd be erased from the social circle you spent your whole life trying to fit into. Because the rules were so strict and so complicated, a massive industry grew up to take advantage of grieving families. They had these huge stores called mourning warehouses. One of the most famous ones was Jay's of London. These places were massive. Imagine a giant department store where every single item is black. They sold everything: black jewelry made of jet, which is a type of coal, black fans, black umbrellas. They even sold black-edged stationery and black wax to seal your letters. That way, people knew you were grieving before they even opened the mail. These shops were like sharks. They knew that when someone died, the family was emotional and vulnerable. They'd send salesmen to your house the second they saw an obituary in the paper. They didn't even wait for the body to be buried. They'd show up at your door with piles of fabric and catalogs. They would tell you that if you didn't buy the most expensive widow's silk, you were disrespecting your dead husband. They'd guilt-trip people into buying things they couldn't afford. This is the part that really hits hard. If you were a middle-class family, you might have been doing okay while the husband was alive. But the second he died, the income stopped. You'd think that would be the time to save money, right? Wrong. The social pressure to have a proper mourning period was so strong that families would spend every cent they had on these outfits in the funeral. They'd go into massive debt. They'd sell their furniture or move into smaller, colder apartments. People were literally starving themselves just to make sure they had the right shade of black crepe. It wasn't just about being sad, it was a status symbol. The more black fabric you wore, the more money you supposedly had. It was a way to show the world that you were refined and that you knew the rules of high society. But the reality was a lot messier. It was a world of toxic dyes, suffocating veils, and families going bankrupt to pay for a costume. They were so focused on looking perfect on the outside that they were destroying their lives and their health on the inside. And just when you thought you'd finally finished your 2 years of mourning and could wear color again, someone else in the family might die. Then the whole clock would start all over again. Some women spent decades of their lives wearing nothing but black, moving from one death to the next, trapped in a cycle that the stores were more than happy to keep fueling. They were grieving for a living, and it was costing them everything.
But here's the thing. While you were busy mourning your husband and buying all those black clothes, you were also walking around in a literal death trap. And I'm not being dramatic. If the grief didn't get you, the fashion definitely would. Let's talk about the crinoline. You've probably seen it in old movies. It's that massive, bell-shaped skirt that looks like a giant cupcake. It looks elegant, sure, but underneath all that fabric, it wasn't just layers of soft petticoats. It was a cage. They literally called it a cage crinoline. It was made of flexible steel hoops held together by fabric straps. On one hand, women actually liked it at first. It was way lighter than wearing 14 layers of heavy wool to get that same puffy look. It gave them some leg room. But on the other hand, it made you about 6 or 7 feet wide. Think about your house for a second. Now imagine trying to walk through your hallways or navigate your living room while wearing a hula hoop the size of a dinner table. It sounds annoying, but in the 1850s, it was lethal. Take away your electric lights, replace them with open fireplaces, floor-level space heaters, and candles sitting on every low table. You can probably see where this is going. Women were constantly knocking things over, but the real problem was that they couldn't feel where the edge of their skirt was. You'd be standing by the fire, talking to a friend, and the back of your dress would brush against a hot coal. Because the skirt was so big and full of air, it acted like a chimney. Once a spark hit that fabric, the whole thing went up in seconds. And because you were literally buckled into a steel cage, you couldn't just kick the dress off. You were stuck inside a burning tent. It happened all the time. In the 1850s and 60s, thousands of women died this way. I'm talking about 3,000 women in England alone over just a few years. It was a total epidemic of fire. There's a famous story about 2 sisters of the writer Oscar Wilde. They were at a ball, dancing and having a great time. One of them got too close to a candle. Her dress caught, and when her sister tried to help her, she caught fire too. They both died. That wasn't some rare freak accident. That was just a regular risk of going to a party. The newspapers even had a name for it, crinoline mania. They mocked women for it, drawing cartoons of them getting stuck in doorways or being blown away by the wind. And that actually happened too. These skirts were so light and wide that a strong gust of wind could pick a woman up or push her right off a pier. There were real police reports of women being blown into the path of horse carriages or even off the edge of cliffs while they were out for a walk. It sounds like something out of a cartoon, but it was a nightmare for anyone trying to just exist in public. But let's say you were careful. Let's say you avoided the candles and stayed inside on windy days. You still had to deal with what was happening underneath your skin. Let's talk about the corset. Now, a lot of people today like to say corsets weren't that bad. They say they were just like a supportive bra, but the Victorians took it to a whole different level. They wanted a waist that was impossibly small. To get it, they used a method called tight lacing. I want you to imagine someone wrapping a heavy-duty, reinforced belt around your stomach. Now imagine them pulling the strings until you can't take a full breath. Now imagine wearing that for 16 hours every single day, starting from the time you're a teenager. When you do that, your body has to put your insides somewhere. Your ribs don't just stay put, they get pushed inward. Over years of wearing these things, a woman's rib cage would actually change shape, bending the bones until they stayed that way permanently. Your lungs were the first to feel it.
They got squashed into the top of your chest. This is the real reason women were always fainting in Victorian stories. They literally couldn't get enough oxygen into their blood to stay conscious. If they got excited or tried to move too fast, their heart would pump, but their lungs couldn't keep up. They'd just black out. It wasn't just for lounging, it was a medical necessity because the fashion was suffocating them. But the real mess was happening lower down. Your liver got shoved downward. Your stomach was compressed so much that you could only eat tiny bits of food at a time. Your intestines were pushed into places they weren't meant to be. Doctors at the time started performing autopsies and finding women whose livers had deep, permanent grooves in them, literal dents from where their own ribs had been pressed against the organ for years. Their internal organs were basically being reshaped to fit a magazine trend. So, why did they do it? Why would you put on a steel cage that might turn you into a human torch? Why wear a vest that moves your liver? Because you had to. And in that world, if you weren't a lady, you didn't have a future. You couldn't get married, you couldn't get a job, and you couldn't survive. It was a choice between a dangerous life or no life at all. They knew it was dangerous. They read the newspapers. They saw the stories of girls burning to death in ballrooms. They felt the sharp pain in their ribs every time they sat down. But the pressure to look the part was stronger than the fear of dying. It's a weird thing to think about. These women were living in a world where their clothes were actively trying to kill them, and they just woke up and put them on every single morning because they didn't have any other choice.
It didn't stop with the clothes, though. Not even close. If you think wearing a dress laced with arsenic is bad, wait until you hear what these women were doing to their faces. They weren't just trying to look pretty. They were trying to look like they were dying. I'm serious. At the time, there was this massive obsession with tuberculosis. They called it consumption back then. It was this horrible lung disease that killed millions, but for some reason, the Victorian elite thought the symptoms were the height of fashion. Think about what happens when someone is really, really sick with a fever. Their skin gets pale and almost see-through. Their eyes get wide and watery. Their cheeks get a little flush of red, and they look incredibly thin and fragile. To the Victorians, that was the ultimate look. It sounds insane to us now, like someone today trying to look like they have the flu for a photo shoot. It meant you probably worked outside in the sun. If you wanted to look like a lady of high society, you had to look like you hadn't seen a sandwich or a sunbeam in 3 years. So, how did they pull it off? They didn't have filters or Photoshop, so they used chemicals. Let's start with the eyes. Big, dark, dilated pupils were a huge part of the look. It made you look like you were in a permanent state of shock, or maybe just deeply in love. To get this, women would take drops of belladonna and squeeze them right onto their eyeballs. Now, if you aren't familiar with belladonna, it's just a fancy name for deadly nightshade. It's one of the most toxic plants on the planet. The juice from the plant forces your pupils to stay wide open because it paralyzes the muscles in your eye. It works, sure. Your eyes look huge and dark, but there's a massive downside. Since your pupils can't react to light anymore, everything gets blurry. Use it too much and your heart starts racing. Use it for a long time and you're going totally blind. Imagine sitting at a dinner party trying to look beautiful for a guy across the table, but you literally can't see the food on your plate because you've poisoned your own eyes to make them look bigger. But the eyes were just the beginning. Next, they had to deal with the skin. To get that ghostly, white-as-a-sheet complexion, they didn't just use a little bit of powder. They went for the hard stuff.
A lot of women would wash their faces with ammonia. You probably have a bottle of that under your sink right now to scrub the floors. It's incredibly harsh. It burns. When the ammonia inevitably caused their skin to break out or get covered in sores, they didn't stop. They just covered the damage with lead-based white paint. They would smear this thick, heavy paste all over their faces, necks, and shoulders. The lead gave them that perfect matte white finish they craved. But lead is a heavy metal. It doesn't just sit on top of the skin, it seeps into the bloodstream. It caused their hair to fall out, it made their teeth rot and turn black, it even caused brain damage. So you'd have these women who were slowly losing their minds in their hair, all while applying more lead paint to hide the fact that the lead paint was killing them. And it gets even weirder. They wanted their skin to look so thin that it was practically transparent. To do this, they'd grab a blue pencil. They would sit in front of the mirror and carefully trace the veins on their chest and their temples. They would literally draw blue lines on themselves to simulate the look of blood vessels showing through thin, sickly skin. They wanted you to be able to see their inner workings, because that proved they were delicate and refined. These were little crackers laced with just enough arsenic to kill off their red blood cells. It gave them that final, deathly pallor that ammonia and paint couldn't quite reach. It also gave them a nice little dose of poison that would eventually lead to organ failure. You have to picture the scene. You've got a woman standing in her bedroom. She's already wearing a corset so tight she can barely breathe. She's wearing a green dress that's off-gassing arsenic into the room. She's blind from the nightshade drops. Her face is covered in lead paint. And she's standing there with a blue pencil, drawing fake veins on her chest so she looks like she's about to die of a lung infection. She wasn't doing this because she was crazy. She was doing it because this was the standard. If you wanted to get married, if you wanted to be respected, if you wanted to be seen as beautiful, this was the price of admission. It was a literal performance of sickness. They were turning their bodies into a crime scene every single morning just to fit into a world that told them their only value was how fragile they could look. They were trading their eyesight, their skin, and their sanity for a trend that celebrated death. And the scariest part is that they knew it. They knew the stuff was toxic. They just didn't have any other way to be seen. So it wasn't just about the person wearing the dress. It wasn't just a fashion choice that went wrong for the person at the party. It was a whole lot bigger than that. Imagine your house right now. Think about the colors on your walls or the toys your kids have in their rooms. Back then, if you wanted to be trendy, you wanted green. But not just any green. You wanted the specific, neon, eye-popping shade that stood out in a candle-lit room. They called it Scheele's green. A chemist named Carl Scheele invented it. He found out that if you mixed copper and arsenic, you got this incredible color that didn't fade. Now, you and I know arsenic is the stuff people use to kill rats or get rid of a rich uncle in a mystery novel. But to a Victorian homeowner, it was just a great way to liven up a boring room. They started putting this stuff in everything. The biggest seller was the wallpaper. People covered every square inch of their houses in this toxic green paper. It looked great, but there was a catch. If your house got a little bit damp, or if some mold started growing behind the paper, it triggered a chemical reaction. The arsenic in the wallpaper turned into a gas. It would just float around the room while you slept. Families would sit down for dinner and breathe in poison without even knowing it. They'd get these massive headaches. Their skin would start to break out. They'd feel weak and tired all the time. Sometimes whole families would just waste away, and the doctors would blame it on bad air or nerves, when really the walls were literally out to get them. Even the kids weren't safe. Think about how kids play. They crawl on the floor, they touch everything, and they put their hands in their mouths. Well, the toy company started using Scheele's green for everything. They made bright green toy soldiers. They made green balls. They even used the arsenic dye for the wrappers on expensive candies. I'm telling you, a kid could get a box of sweets for their birthday and end up in the hospital because they licked the green paper. It's wild to think about, but it was just a normal part of life. Nobody was checking the labels because there were no labels to check. But the people who really had it the worst weren't the people living in the green houses. It was the people making the stuff. This is where the story gets really ugly. Think about a young girl living in London or New York. She's 19 years old and she needs a job. She gets hired at a workshop that makes fancy dresses or artificial flowers for hats. She thinks she's hit the jackpot. She's working with beautiful fabrics and making things for the richest people in the city. But the reality was a nightmare. These girls would spend 12 to 14 hours a day in small, cramped rooms with almost no windows. Their job was to take these massive bolts of fabric that had been dyed with arsenic and turn them into dresses. Every time they cut the cloth, a fine green dust would fly up into the air. It was everywhere. It was in their hair, it was in their lungs, and it was stuck under their fingernails. After a few weeks of this, their bodies started to fall apart. Arsenic is a corrosive. It eats away at whatever it touches. Since these girls were constantly handling the fabric, their hands were the first thing to go. They'd start getting these tiny red bumps. They'd itch at first, but then they'd turn into deep, painful sores. The scabs would turn black. Eventually, the sores would start to ooze. Their skin was basically rotting while they were still alive. And it wasn't just their hands. The dust would settle in the folds of their skin. They'd get sores under their arms, behind their knees, and all over their faces. They looked like they had some kind of plague. But they couldn't just quit. They needed the money. So they kept sewing. They kept breathing in that green powder every single day. There was this one girl, Matilda Schurer. She was only 19. Her job was to make those little green leaves you'd see on fancy headbands. She'd take a brush, dip it in the green arsenic powder, and dust it over the fabric leaves. She did this thousands of times a day. She was basically living in a cloud of poison. One day, Matilda started throwing up, but it wasn't normal. She was vomiting this bright green liquid. Her fingernails turned white. The whites of her eyes actually started to turn a yellowish-green color. She was in so much pain that she was screaming for someone to kill her just to make it stop. She died in total agony. When the doctors did an autopsy on her, they were shocked. Her stomach, her liver, and her lungs were all stained with the dye. The poison had literally soaked through her entire body. When the news of Matilda's death hit the papers, people started to freak out. A doctor even took one of those fancy green dresses and did some math. He found out that a single dress had enough arsenic in it to kill 30 people. Think about that. A woman would walk into a ballroom wearing enough poison to wipe out everyone at her table. She was a walking biohazard. But here's the kicker. Even after the public found out about Matilda, The trend didn't just stop. Some people tried to defend it. They said the girls were just unclean, or that they were getting sick because they didn't wash their hands enough. The companies didn't want to stop using the dye because it was cheap and it looked better than the safe alternatives. The customers were just as bad. They knew the dresses were killing the girls who made them. They knew the wallpaper was making their own children sick. But that bright green was just too pretty to give up. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to look rich. And in the Victorian era, looking good was worth dying for. They just kept buying it, they kept sewing it, and they kept dying, all for a color that was literally eating them from the inside out. It wasn't until years later, after way too many deaths like Matilda's, that the government finally stepped in and told people they couldn't put rat poison in their living rooms anymore. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands of people had already paid the price for a trend that was never meant to be safe. So, after the government finally stepped in and told people they couldn't put rat poison in their living rooms anymore, you'd think the Victorians would have taken a breath and decided to play it safe for a while. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands of people had already paid the price for a trend that was never meant to be safe. And honestly, the poison wallpaper was just the tip of the iceberg. If you think having toxic walls was a bad move, you haven't seen anything yet. Because the Victorians had a new obsession, and this one didn't come from a factory. It came from the desert. See, around this time, everyone in England became absolutely obsessed with ancient Egypt. It all started when Napoleon went over there with his army and brought back stories of giant pyramids and hidden gold. Suddenly, every rich person in London decided they needed a piece of that history. But they didn't just want a nice vase or a statue of a cat. They wanted the people. They wanted mummies. I'm not talking about one or two museum pieces either. I'm talking about a full-blown trade. It was like a gold rush, but for dead bodies. Grave robbers in Egypt realized they were sitting on a literal mountain of cash. They started digging up every tomb they could find. They didn't care about history or respect. They just saw dollar signs. They'd pull these ancient bodies out of the sand, wrap them up, and shove them into crates like they were shipping crates of tea or lumber. These bodies were loaded onto ships and sent across the ocean to England. When they arrived, they were sold at auctions. You could literally walk into a shop in London and buy a 3,000-year-old human being just as easily as you could buy a new dining room table. And if you were a rich Victorian with some money to burn, that's exactly what you did. You bought a mummy. But the question is, what do you do with a dead pharaoh once you get him home? Well, if you were part of the high society crowd, you threw a party. These were called unwrapping parties, and they were the hottest ticket in town. Imagine getting an invitation in the mail that says, "Come over to my place on Friday night." It sounds like a horror movie to us, but to them it was the height of fashion. The host would set up a big table in the middle of the living room. They'd put the mummy right there under the chandelier. They'd have the best gin and port flowing, and guests would show up in their finest clothes. Everyone would gather around the table with their drinks in hand, leaning in close to get a good look. Then the host would start. They'd grab the end of the bandages and just start pulling. It wasn't some careful scientific process. It was a show. They'd rip the linen away, and as the layers came off, the smell would hit the room. We're talking about thousands of years of dust, resin, and decaying skin. It must have been stomach-turning, but these people didn't care. They were fascinated. Sometimes they'd find little gold charms or pieces of jewelry tucked inside the wrappings. They'd pass these around for everyone to touch. They'd poke at the dry, leathery skin and marvel at the teeth or the hair that was still attached to the skull. They treated these ancient people like they were some kind of party trick. They were literally tearing apart a human life just to have something to talk about over their cocktails. One guy, a surgeon named Thomas Pettigrew, became a local celebrity for this. He'd stand there in front of a crowd of hundreds, narrating the whole thing like he was performing a play. It was gruesome, and it was everywhere. But as weird as the parties were, the Victorians took it a step further. They didn't just want to look at the dead, they wanted to eat them. I know, it sounds like something I'm making up, but I promise I'm not. There was this long-standing medical belief that mummies had healing powers. Doctors and pharmacists would take the bones and the dried-up flesh of these ancient Egyptians and grind them down into a fine brown powder. You could go to your local corner drugstore and find a jar of mumia sitting right there on the shelf next to the cough syrup. If you had a bad headache, the doctor might tell you to swallow a spoonful of ground-up person. If you had a stomach ache or a bruise that wouldn't go away, you'd mix some mummy dust into your wine or your water and drink it right down. They really believed that because these bodies had been preserved for thousands of years, they contained some kind of life force or secret energy. They thought that by eating the dead, they could fix their own living bodies. It was a literal pharmacy of human remains. They were eating the history they claimed to love. Think about that for a second. You're sitting in your living room surrounded by that arsenic green wallpaper that's slowly poisoning your lungs. You've got a headache because of the fumes, so you reach for a jar of ground-up bones from a guy who died 3,000 years ago in a different country. You swallow a bit of him, wash it down with some tea, and go about your day. The Victorians didn't see the horror in it. To them, the world was just a collection of things to be owned and used. They didn't see a human being when they looked at a mummy. They saw a souvenir. They saw a medicine. They saw a way to show their friends how much money they had. They were so focused on being modern and fancy that they lost any sense of what was actually sane. They were shipping thousands of people across the sea, ripping them apart for fun, and eating the leftovers to cure a cold. It was a cycle of death that they just couldn't get enough of. They were obsessed with the past, but they were destroying it as fast as they could dig it up. And as the craze grew, they started running out of real mummies. But did that stop them? Of course not. They just started making fake ones, using the bodies of criminals or people who died in the streets just to keep up with the demand. The whole thing was a nightmare disguised as a hobby. They were living in a world where death was everywhere, in their clothes, in their walls, and now, literally, in their stomachs. They had turned the ancient dead into a commodity, and they didn't stop until there was almost nothing left to dig up. It was a trend that showed just how far people will go when they want to feel important.
And in the Victorian era, being important meant having a dead pharaoh on your dinner table and his bones in your medicine cabinet. Eating a pharaoh for breakfast was just the start of how weird the Victorians got with the dead. It showed just how far people will go when they want to feel important. And in the Victorian era, being important meant having a dead pharaoh on your dinner table and his bones in your medicine cabinet. But things got even more personal when death stayed a little closer to home. When a family member died back then, they didn't just call an undertaker and wait for a funeral. They called a photographer. I know it sounds like something out of a horror movie, but you have to understand the world they lived in. This was a time when death was everywhere. People didn't die in hospitals tucked away from sight. They died in their own beds, in the room right next to the kitchen. Most kids didn't even make it to their 5th birthday. Death was a neighbor you couldn't avoid. And because cameras were brand new and really expensive, most people didn't have a single picture of themselves. Not one. You could live 60 years and never actually see a permanent image of your own face. So when a child or a parent died, the family realized something terrifying. They were going to forget what that person looked like. They didn't have a cell phone to scroll through 1,000 selfies. They had nothing but their own shaky memories. That's where the post-mortem photographer came in. It was a real job, and these guys were busy. A photographer would get a knock on his door in the middle of the night, and he'd have to grab his heavy wooden camera, his glass plates, and his chemicals. He'd load it all into a wagon and head over to a house where someone had just passed away. When he got there, he wasn't there to take a picture of a body in a coffin. He was there to bring the person back to life, at least for the camera. The family would have the body dressed in their best Sunday clothes. I'm talking about the fancy lace, the stiff collars, and the polished boots. And this is where it gets really intense. Have you ever tried to make a limp body sit up in a chair? It doesn't want to stay. It slumps. It slides. To fix this, the photographer brought along these heavy iron stands. They had a big weighted base and a long metal pole that went up the back. At the top of the pole, there were these little metal arms or brackets. The photographer would slide the base of the stand behind the chair. Then he'd lift the dead person and hook those metal arms under their armpits or right at the base of their skull. He'd tighten the screws until the person was held upright and stiff. If you look at these old photos today, you can actually see the metal feet of the stands peeking out from behind the person's shoes. They tried to hide them with long dresses or drapes, but they didn't always do a great job. Once the person was standing or sitting up, the photographer had to handle the limbs. He'd use wire or string to tie their hands together so they looked like they were resting naturally in their lap. He might prop an arm up on a table to make it look like the person was leaning on it, just thinking about something. He'd tilt the head just a little bit to the side to give it a look of life. It was all about the plot of the photo. They wanted it to look like a normal day, but there was a big problem: the eyes. When you die, your eyes lose that shine. They sink back into the head and get cloudy. Sometimes they wouldn't stay open at all. If the photographer took the picture like that, it would look exactly like what it was, a photo of a corpse. To fix this, they did two things. First, they'd try to prop the eyelids open with small tools. If that didn't look right, they'd just take the photo with the eyes closed. But they didn't stop there. After the photographer went back to his darkroom and developed the glass plate, he'd get out a tiny brush. He'd sit there for hours with some paint, and he'd actually paint pupils and irises right onto the photo. He'd draw them in to make the person look like they were staring right at the camera. He might even add a little bit of pink paint to the cheeks so the person didn't look so pale and gray. When he was done, you had a photo of a person who looked almost alive, maybe just a little bit sleepy or dazed. I want you to imagine the scene in the house while this was happening. It wasn't just the dead person and the photographer. The whole family was usually there, and often they wanted to be in the picture too. You'll see photos where a mother is sitting on a sofa holding her dead baby. She's trying her best to look calm, but she has to sit perfectly still for 3 or 5 minutes because that's how long the camera takes to capture the image. If she moves, the photo is ruined. So she sits there, clutching her child, staring into a lens while the smell of chemicals and death fills the room.
In some photos, you'll see a row of 4 or 5 children. They're all standing in a line, looking at the camera. It's only when you look closely that you realize the one in the middle is being held up by a stand. The siblings are touching their brother's shoulder or holding his hand. To them, this wasn't morbid. It was their last chance to be a family together. It was the only way they could keep a piece of him. Now, you might wonder why they went through all this trouble. Why not just remember them? But you have to remember how much a photo cost. For a poor family, a post-mortem photo might cost a week's worth of wages. It was a huge investment. They'd save up their money or skip meals just to afford that one session with the photographer. For many of these families, this was literally the only photo they ever owned. They didn't have pictures of the wedding. They didn't have pictures of the birthdays. This one image, taken after the heart had stopped beating, was the only proof they had that their loved one was ever here. When the photo was finished, the photographer would put it in a nice little case, usually lined with velvet. The family would take it home, and it would become their most prized possession. They didn't hide it in a drawer because it was creepy. They put it on the mantel. They showed it to guests. They carried it in their pockets.
It was a way to keep the dead as part of the living world. It tells us a lot about how they viewed the end of life. They didn't have the luxury of being squeamish. They had to deal with the reality of the body. They touched the dead, they dressed the dead, and they stood next to them for long, silent minutes while a camera clicked away. They wanted to hold on to the face of someone they loved, and they were willing to use metal stands, wire, and paint to make it happen. It was a desperate, messy, and very human way to say goodbye. And while we might look at those painted-on eyes and feel a shiver down our spines, to a Victorian mother, those painted eyes were the only way she could ever see her child's gaze again. It wasn't about being macabre. It was about not being alone. But if a photo wasn't enough to make you feel like your loved one was still there, you went for something more physical. You didn't just want a picture of them, you wanted a part of them. And the easiest, most durable part of a human being you can keep forever, without it rotting, is hair. Think about the moment someone died back then. The house went quiet. You covered the mirrors with black cloth so the soul wouldn't get trapped. But before the undertaker showed up to take the body away, you grabbed a pair of scissors. You didn't just take a little snip for a locket. You cut off long, thick locks. You took as much as you could get. If it was a sister or a mother or a child, you wanted enough to actually build something. Once that body was in the ground, that hair was the only physical substance left of them on the entire earth. You couldn't just take that hair and braid it. It was dirty. It had oils and dust and whatever sickness might have killed them. So the first thing you did was boil it. You'd put the hair in a pot of water mixed with a little bit of soda and let it bubble for about half an hour. That stripped away the grime and the smell. Then you'd dry it out and sort it. You'd put the long strands in one pile and the short ones in another. You needed those long strands for the complicated stuff. The process of actually making the jewelry was called table work. It looked a lot like making lace, but instead of silk thread, you were using human remains. You had a special table with a hole in the center. You'd sit there with your hair strands and tie little lead weights to the ends of them. These weights kept the hair tight so it wouldn't tangle. Then you'd start crossing the strands over each other in specific patterns. You'd move them back and forth, weaving them around a central wire or a mold. This is where the wire comes in. Hair by itself is soft. If you want a bracelet that holds its shape, you need a skeleton. So you'd take a thin piece of copper or brass wire and wrap the hair around it.
This was called gimping. You'd wrap and wrap until the metal was completely hidden. Now, instead of a flimsy lock of hair, you had a stiff, flexible rod made of hair and metal. You could bend these rods into circles for rings or loop them into flower petals. If you were doing this at home, you probably had a book of patterns. These books were everywhere. You'd spend hours at that table, moving those little weights around, slowly watching a tube of hair grow through the hole in the center of the table. When you were done, you'd take the piece and boil it one more time. This helped set the shape. Then you'd take it to a jeweler who would add gold caps to the ends so the hair wouldn't fray or unravel. What you ended up with was a piece of jewelry that was surprisingly tough. It didn't feel like hair anymore. It felt like wood or hard plastic. Men would wear watch chains made of their dead wife's hair. They'd clip it to their vest and feel that weight against their stomach all day. Every time they checked the time, they were touching her. Women wore heavy bracelets made of their children's hair.
Sometimes they'd mix the hair of 3 or 4 different kids into one piece. And then there were the wreaths. These were the big projects. If you had a lot of hair from a lot of different people, you didn't make a ring, you made a wall decoration. You'd take that hair-covered wire and twist it into hundreds of tiny flowers. You'd use Grandma's white hair for the center of a lily, and your cousin's brown hair for the leaves. You'd build this massive horseshoe-shaped wreath. They always left the top of the horseshoe open because that symbolized the path to heaven. They would mount these wreaths in shadow boxes. These were deep wooden frames with glass fronts. They'd hang them right in the parlor where everyone could see them. It was a family tree made of actual family. If a new baby was born, you'd add a little flower made of their hair to the bottom. When someone died, you'd move their hair flower to a more prominent spot. It was a living, breathing record of who was gone and who was still here. Now, you might wonder if people ever cheated. The answer is yes. This was a huge industry by the mid-1800s. You could mail a lock of hair to a company in a big city and they'd send you back a finished bracelet. But people were paranoid. They were scared the jeweler would just throw their hair in the trash and use some random hair they bought from a barber shop. To stop this, some women would actually sit in the jewelry shop and watch the person work. They'd stay there for 5 or 6 hours, just staring, making sure that every single strand going into that ring actually came from their husband's head. You have to remember how common death was. You didn't go to a hospital to die back then. You died in your bed. Your family washed your body. They sat with you in the living room for days before the funeral. Death wasn't a mystery or something you hid away. It was right there in your face. So wearing a dead person's hair didn't feel gross to them. It felt loyal. If you lost your sister to tuberculosis when she was only 20, you had a hole in your life that nothing could fill. But if you had a bracelet made of her hair, you had a physical connection. You could feel the texture of it. You could see the way the light hit the exact shade of brown you remembered from when you were kids. It was a way to keep her from disappearing completely. The Victorians were obsessed with not forgetting. They lived in a world where you could be fine on Monday and dead by Thursday. They needed something to hold on to. These pieces of jewelry weren't just fashion accessories. They were anchors. They were a way to say that even though the person was under the ground, a part of them was still walking around, going to church, and sitting down for dinner. When you look at one of these hair wreaths today in an antique shop, it might look a little creepy. It's a bit dusty, and the hair might be 150 years old. But you have to see the work that went into it.
Every single one of those tiny woven flowers represents hours of someone sitting at a table, mourning. Every wire was wrapped by hand. Every boil was timed.
It was a labor of love that turned a piece of a corpse into a piece of art. They did it because they couldn't bear to let go. They did it so they wouldn't have to be alone in a world that was constantly taking people away from them. And when you look at it that way, it's not macabre at all. It's just human.
So, if you're trying to keep your family close because life feels short and fragile, you'd think the dinner table would be a safe place to relax. But in the Victorian era, sitting down to eat was like stepping into a minefield. You weren't just worrying about your manners. You were worrying about whether the food on your plate was actually food at all. It turns out that staying alive was just as hard as mourning the dead. Let's talk about soup. Back then, if you were rich, you ate green turtle soup. It was the ultimate status symbol. But turtles were expensive. They had to be shipped from far away, and they were hard to keep alive. So, if you were middle class and wanted to look fancy without spending a fortune, you made mock turtle soup. You didn't use a turtle. Instead, you went to the butcher and bought a calf's head. You took that head home, threw it in a giant pot, and boiled it for hours. You'd watch the skin go pale and the eyes turn cloudy as the water bubbled. Eventually, the meat got soft enough to fall right off the skull. You'd chop up the ears and the snout to mimic the texture of turtle meat. You'd even use the brains to thicken the broth. It was a greasy, gray mess that people served at their best parties just to prove they had good taste. People actually looked forward to eating a bowl of boiled face because it made them feel like they were moving up in the world. But at least you knew what was in the calf's head. You saw the butcher cut it. The bigger problem was the stuff you bought at the corner store. This was a time before the government checked your food. There were no labels, there were no inspections, there were no Best Buy dates. Manufacturers realized they could make a lot more money if they swapped out expensive ingredients for cheap, dangerous ones. They didn't care if it made you sick. They just wanted the food to look good on the shelf. Take bread, for instance. To make a good loaf of bread, you need high-quality flour. But flour cost money, so bakers started mixing in things like alum. That's a chemical used today in some deodorants and for tanning leather. Back then, it made old, cheap yellow flour look white and fresh. If they ran out of alum, they'd use ground-up bones, chalk, or even plaster of Paris. People were literally eating bits of their own walls for breakfast. If you've ever wondered why Victorian kids were often so small and sickly, it's because their daily bread had almost zero nutrients in it. Milk was even worse. Farmers and shopkeepers would water it down to make it go further. Once it was watered down, it looked thin and blue. To fix that, they'd stir in a little chalk or some plaster to make it look creamy and thick again. If the milk started to smell like it was rotting, they'd add borax or formaldehyde to kill the scent and stop the visible mold. In London, thousands of kids died every year because they were drinking milk filled with bacteria and floor cleaner. They thought they were giving their toddlers a healthy drink, but they were actually handing them a glass of poison. Then you have the colors. Victorians loved bright colors on their table. They thought if food looked vibrant, it must be high quality. But nature isn't always that bright, especially after food has been sitting in a jar for a month. If you bought a jar of pickles and they looked a little dull or brownish, the manufacturer had a fix. They'd drop in some copper sulfate. It made the pickles a vibrant, beautiful, fake green. The problem is, copper sulfate is toxic. If you ate enough of those pickles, you'd end up with a ruined stomach, liver failure, or worse. They did the same thing with mustard. Real mustard can be a bit brown or a dull, earthy yellow. To get that bright neon kick that customers wanted, they added lead chromate. They were putting lead in the mustard people put on their roast beef. They put it in candy, too. If you bought a bag of red sweets for your kids, there was a good chance the red dye was made from red lead or mercury. It made the candy look amazing, but it was slowly poisoning the children who ate it. Even the tea wasn't safe. Scammers would take used tea leaves, dry them out, and dye them with sheep poop or iron filings to make them look dark and fresh again. You could spend your whole day eating nothing but chemicals and trash without even knowing it. Now imagine trying to survive those poisons while attending a fancy dinner party. You couldn't just sit down and eat. A Victorian dinner was a social test that lasted for hours. First, you had to wear the right clothes. For women, this meant a corset so tight it pushed your ribs inward and squashed your lungs. It's hard to eat a 10-course meal when you can't even take a full breath. For men, it meant stiff collars and heavy wool suits, even in a room filled with 100 candles and no air conditioning. When you finally sat down, you'd see a mountain of silverware. There were different forks for everything. You had a fork for fish, a fork for salad, a fork for meat, and a tiny little fork for oysters. If you picked up the wrong one, the whole room would notice. The person sitting next to you might stop talking to you. Your host might never invite you back. People would literally lose their social standing because they didn't know which piece of silver to use for a piece of asparagus. It sounds silly now, but back then, using the wrong fork meant you didn't belong. It meant you were a fake. And you couldn't just talk to whoever you wanted. There was a strict rule for that, too. You had to talk to the person on your right for the first few courses. Then, at a specific signal from the host, usually the woman of the house, everyone at the table would switch at the exact same time and start talking to the person on their left. If you missed the cue because you were busy trying to chew a piece of tough meat, you'd end up staring at the back of someone's head while everyone else chatted away. You'd be left in total silence, looking like an idiot in front of the most important people in town. The meals themselves were an endurance test. You'd sit through course after course of heavy, rich food. You might have roasted meats, jellied eels, meat pies, and that weird calf's head soup. You had to eat a little bit of everything to be polite, even if you were suspicious of the bright green peas or the strangely white bread.
You'd sit there, sweating in your heavy clothes, trying to remember the dozens of rules about how to hold your glass and how to break your bread without using a knife. It was a weird way to live. On one hand, you had these incredibly strict rules about how to hold a spoon. On the other hand, the people selling you that spoon's worth of food were basically trying to kill you for an extra penny. You spent your whole day trying to look perfect and act perfect, but the very things you needed to stay alive were the things most likely to kill you. Life was a constant gamble. You navigated a world of boiled heads and lead-filled candy, all while trying to make sure you didn't use the salad fork for your fish. It wasn't just about being fancy. It was about performing a role in a society that was obsessed with appearances, even when those appearances were literally deadly. Every meal was a risk, and every dinner party was a stage. When you look at what they put on their plates and how they had to eat it, it's a miracle anyone survived long enough to have their photo taken at all. But even if you managed to dodge the poison in your food and the toxins in your wallpaper, you couldn't stay lucky forever. Eventually, you were going to get a headache, a fever, or a nasty cough, and that is where the real nightmare began. See, in the Victorian era, the medicine was often way more dangerous than the sickness itself. If you thought the fashion was scary, wait until you see what was waiting for you in the doctor's bag. If you walked into a clinic back then, feeling a bit under the weather, the first thing the doctor would do is look at your blood. They didn't do a blood test like we do now. They didn't want to check your cholesterol or your iron levels. They just thought you had too much blood. They called it being sanguine, and they believed your body was like a plumbing system that got too much pressure. To fix you, they had to let some of that pressure out. This is where the leeches came in. Imagine sitting in a wooden chair while a man in a black coat pulls a glass jar off the shelf. Inside that jar are hundreds of hungry, slimy, blood-sucking worms. These weren't just any worms, they were medicinal leeches. The doctor would take a pair of tweezers, grab a few, and plop them right onto your skin, maybe on your temple for a headache, or on your chest for a cough. The leech would latch on with its tiny teeth and start drinking. It would inject a chemical into your skin so you wouldn't feel the bite, and another chemical to keep your blood from clotting. A single leech could drink several times its own weight. Once they were fat and full, they'd just fall off your skin like giant purple grapes. It sounds gross, but it was a massive business. Doctors in London and Paris used millions of leeches every single year. It got so bad that they actually started running out of them in the wild. People made entire careers out of wading into swamps and letting leeches attach to their legs just so they could pull them off and sell them to the local pharmacy. But here's the thing. If you were already sick and weak, the last thing you needed was to lose a pint of blood. It didn't cure the infection, it just made you too tired to complain about it. If the leeches didn't work, the doctor might pull out a scarificator. That was a brass box with a spring-loaded trigger. When he pulled the trigger, a dozen tiny blades would pop out and slice into your skin all at once. They'd then put a heated glass cup over the cuts to suck the blood out. It was messy, it was painful, and it didn't save anyone. As the years went by, people started getting a little tired of being stabbed and drained. They wanted something modern. They wanted something that felt like the future. And in the late 1800s, the future was electricity. People didn't really understand how it worked yet, but they knew it was powerful. So the mail-order catalogs started filling up with miracle devices. The most popular one was the electric belt. You could buy these through the mail without ever talking to a doctor. You'd get a big, heavy leather belt lined with metal plates and wires. You'd strap it around your waist, right against your skin, and it would give you a constant buzzing electric shock all day long. The ads promised that this vitality would flow into your organs and cure everything from back pain to kidney failure. In reality, these belts didn't do anything for your health. Most of the time, the batteries were so weak they didn't do anything at all. But sometimes they'd malfunction and give the wearer actual electrical burns. People wore them for months, walking around with itchy, burned skin, thinking the pain was just the healing taking place. It was a total scam, but thousands of people fell for it because they were desperate to feel better. And this is where things got really dark. Back then, there were no laws about what you could put in a bottle. There was no FDA checking the labels. If you had a cough that wouldn't quit, you didn't buy a cherry-flavored lozenge. You bought a bottle of heroin. That isn't a joke. One of the biggest drug companies in the world marketed heroin as a non-addictive cough suppressant. They told people it was safer than morphine. You could buy it over the counter and take a spoonful before bed. It wasn't just heroin either.
If you were feeling tired or depressed, the doctor might prescribe you some cocaine. You could get cocaine lozenges for a sore throat or cocaine wine to give you a boost during the day. It worked in the short term because, well, it's cocaine. You felt great for an hour, but then you'd crash and you'd need more. Soon, you weren't just a person with a cold, you were a person with a massive drug habit. And because these drugs were in everything, from toothache drops to dandruff cures, regular people became addicts without even knowing why. The worst part of this drug craze was how it hit the nursery. Being a parent in a crowded Victorian city was loud and stressful. Babies cried because they were hungry or teething or just because the air was full of coal smoke. To help calm the kids, companies sold soothing syrups. One of the most famous ones was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The ads showed a kind, grandmotherly woman holding a peaceful baby. It looked totally innocent. But if you looked at the ingredients, it was mostly just morphine and high-proof alcohol. A mother would give her fussy baby a teaspoon of this stuff, and within minutes the baby would stop crying. They'd go into a deep, heavy sleep. To the parents, it seemed like a miracle. But sometimes that quietness lasted forever. Mothers would wake up the next morning to find their baby had stopped breathing in the middle of the night. They had overdosed. These bottles were nicknamed baby killers by the few doctors who realized what was happening, but they stayed on the shelves for decades. Think about that for a second. You're a regular person living in 1880. You've got a bad tooth, so you take some cocaine drops. Your husband has a cough, so he's taking heroin syrup, and the baby is sleeping off a dose of morphine. The whole family is essentially walking around in a drug-induced fog just to get through the day. They weren't trying to party. They were just trying to follow the medical advice of the time. They trusted the labels and the people in the white coats. By the time the Victorian era was winding down, people were starting to realize that their cures were killing them. They realized that maybe draining your blood when you're sick is a bad idea.
They realized that shocking your stomach with a belt won't fix your liver. And they finally started to see that giving hard drugs to toddlers was a recipe for disaster. But for a long time, the medicine cabinet was the most dangerous place in the house. It's a miracle anyone survived long enough to grow old, especially when you consider that even if you survived the doctor, you still had to survive the very air you breathed.
Since death was basically a roommate for the average Victorian, it's not a surprise they got a little obsessed with it. If you lived in a house where the wallpaper could kill you and the water was full of literal waste, you probably spent a lot of time wondering where you'd end up next. But they didn't just want to wonder about the afterlife. They wanted to grab a chair, sit down, and have a chat with it. This wasn't just a few weird people in a basement either. This was a massive countrywide craze. It was the biggest trend of the century. And it all started because two bored kids in New York learned how to crack their toes and ankles really loudly against the wooden floorboards or the bedpost. It was a prank. It was a joke that got way out of hand. But back then, people were so desperate to believe their dead relatives were still around that they didn't look for a logical explanation. They saw it as proof of life after death. Maggie and Kate went on tour. They filled massive halls. Thousands of people paid good money just to hear some kids crack their bones in the dark. It sparked a movement called spiritualism. Suddenly, everyone thought they could be a medium. Before long, every living room in London and New York was being turned into a séance room.
If you wanted to talk to your dead Aunt Martha, you'd hire a medium and invite some friends over. You'd all sit around a table and hold hands to form what they called a circle of energy. The most important rule? The lights had to be off. It had to be pitch black. Now, if someone tells you they can show you a miracle, but only if you close your eyes or turn off the lights, you should probably check your wallet. But the Victorians jumped right in. Once the room was dark, the ghosts would show up. You'd hear bells ringing in the corner. You'd feel a cold breeze. Sometimes a ghostly hand would brush against your face. If you were really lucky, the medium would produce ectoplasm. This was supposed to be spirit matter leaking out of the medium's body. In reality, it was usually just strips of cheesecloth, muslin, or even chewed-up paper that the medium had hidden in their clothes or swallowed earlier and threw back up. Yeah, it was gross, but in a dark, candlelit room filled with grieving people, a piece of wet fabric looks a lot like a ghost. The tricks were actually pretty clever for the time. Mediums used all sorts of gadgets. They had telescopic reaching rods hidden in their sleeves to move objects across the room. They used thin silk strings that you couldn't see in the dark to pull bells or play instruments. Some of them even used a chemical called phosphorus. It's the stuff that glows in the dark. They'd rub it on their gloves or on a fake face they'd made out of wood, and they wave it around in the blackness. To a person who just lost a child, that glowing shape looked like an angel. It was a huge business built on top of people's sadness. Eventually, some people started getting suspicious. Magicians like Harry Houdini later made it his life's mission to prove these people were fakes, but back in the mid-1800s it was hard to prove. One of the most popular tricks was the spirit cabinet. The medium would be tied up and put inside a wooden box or behind a curtain. Then instruments would start playing, and hands would wave from the top of the box. The logic was that since the medium was tied up, it had to be ghosts. But these mediums were basically escape artists. They knew how to expand their muscles while being tied, so the ropes stayed loose. As soon as the curtain closed, they'd slip out, ring the bells, and jump back in the ropes before the lights came on. While the rich were paying for expensive seances, the regular folks were looking for a DIY way to talk to the dead. That's how we got the Ouija board. But it didn't start out as the portal to hell that movies make it out to be today. In the 1890s, a guy named Charles Kennard and a lawyer named Elijah Bond saw how much people loved talking to spirits and realized they could make a killing if they turned it into a board game. They called it the talking board. When they went to the patent office, the official there told them that if the board could spell his name, he'd give them the patent. He thought he was calling their bluff, but they sat down, put their hands on the little wooden pointer, the planchette, and it spelled his name perfectly. They got the patent that day. It was probably just a mix of the French and German words for yes, but good luck sounded better for sales. The brilliant part was how they sold it. They didn't put it in magic shops. They put it in the toy section of the local department store, right next to the dolls and the wooden trains. It was marketed as a fun parlor game. It was actually a great way for young men and women to flirt. Think about it. You're sitting in a dimly lit room, your knees are touching under the table, and you're both holding on to this little piece of wood. It was the ultimate icebreaker. But why did it move? It wasn't ghosts, and usually people weren't even lying. It's something called the ideomotor effect. It's a fancy way of saying your brain can make your muscles move without you realizing it. If you really want the board to say yes, your hand will push the pointer toward yes, even if you think you're sitting perfectly still. It's the same reason people think dowsing rods work to find water. Your body is just following your expectations. For a long time, the Ouija board was just a harmless hobby. It wasn't until much later, around the time of the World Wars, and then again in the 1970s, that people started thinking it was dangerous or demonic. For the Victorians, it was just another tool in the kit.
They were living in a world that was changing way too fast. They had steam engines, telegraphs, and factories, but they still had no idea why their kids were dying of basic fevers. They were stuck between the old world of magic and the new world of science. Talking to a ghost through a wooden board or a cracking toe felt just as possible as sending a message through a wire across the ocean. They weren't stupid, they were just lonely for the people they'd lost. And in a house full of poison and shadows, a little hope from the other side was worth any price, even if it was just a con artist with a piece of cheesecloth and a very loud big toe.
But look, you can only live in a house of cards for so long. Eventually, the wind blows. For the Victorians, that wind started as a breeze when the old lady herself finally called it quits. In January 1901, Queen Victoria died. She had been on the throne for 63 years. Most people living then couldn't remember a world without her. She was the anchor for all those weird rules and all that heavy, dark furniture. When she went, the anchor snapped. Suddenly, it was the 20th century. People didn't want to live in a museum anymore. They wanted air. They wanted light. They wanted to stop accidentally killing themselves with their own wallpaper. But change didn't happen overnight. It took a massive, violent shove to really kill off the Victorian way of life. That shove was World War I. When the war started in 1914, it didn't just break empires, it broke the class system. Before the war, if you were rich, you had a small army of servants. You had someone to cook, someone to clean, and someone to help you squeeze into a corset that moved your internal organs around. But when the war broke out, those servants left. The men went to the trenches, the women went to work in factories making shells and uniforms. After the war ended, those people didn't want to go back to scrubbing floors for a few cents a day. They had seen the world. They had earned their own money. The upstairs-downstairs life was dead. You couldn't run a massive, drafty mansion without a staff, so people started moving into smaller, more efficient houses. They traded the velvet curtains for things they could actually wash. While the social world was shifting, the legal world finally caught up too. For decades, doctors had been shouting that the food and the clothes were toxic. Finally, the government started listening. They passed laws like the Sale of Food and Drugs Act. They made it a crime to put lead in the milk or chalk in the flour. They banned those bright green arsenic dyes that had been making women sick for 50 years. They didn't do it because they were nice. They did it because they realized a sick, poisoned population couldn't work or fight in wars. Then there was the rise of the factory. In the mid-Victorian years, you bought a lot of stuff from local guys who mixed their own potions and paints in their backyards. There was no way to know what was in the bottle. But by the early 1900s, mass production took over. You started buying brand-name goods. These big companies realized that if their product killed 1,000 people, they'd go out of business. So they standardized things. They used science to make sure the soap didn't burn your skin and the bread didn't contain plaster of Paris. Technology helped kill the shadows, too. Think about the light bulb. Victorian houses were dark, cramped, and filled with soot from coal fires and gas lamps. Gas lamps were terrifying. They leaked, they exploded, and they turned the air into a thick soup. When electric light moved into the home, you could finally see the dirt. You could see the grime on the heavy rugs. They started throwing out the heavy drapes and the stuffed dead animals. They painted the walls white. They wanted things clean and sterile. The obsession with death started to fade away as well. Medicine was getting better. We discovered germs.
We realized that maybe we shouldn't keep a lock of a dead person's hair in a locket around our necks if they died of something contagious. People stopped turning their living rooms into shrines for the deceased. They started looking forward instead of backward. The Victorian era was a wild ride. It was a time when humans were inventing the modern world, but didn't have the safety manual yet. They were the guinea pigs for the Industrial Revolution. They wore the poison, they ate the lead, and they breathed the soot so that we wouldn't have to. We look back at them and think they were formal and stiff, but really, they were just trying to survive a world that was accidentally trying to kill them at every turn. By the time the 1920s rolled around, the Victorian world was a ghost. The dresses got shorter, the colors got safer, and the food actually became food. They traded their dead photos for snapshots of kids playing in the sun. They moved out of the shadows and into the light. And honestly, after 40 years of arsenic and cheesecloth ghosts, you can't really blame them for wanting a fresh start. They left the poison behind and walked into the modern world, probably feeling a lot lighter without all that lead in their makeup. So those folks stepped out of those heavy, toxic clothes and walked right into a world that started to look a bit more like the one we live in now. But even though the arsenic is gone, they didn't leave everything behind, not by a long shot. We like to think we're totally different from them, but we're still carrying their luggage. Think about the last time you went to a funeral. What did you wear? You probably wore black. Most of us do. Before the Victorians came along, mourning was a bit of a mixed bag. You wore what you had. But then Queen Victoria's husband, Albert, passed away. She was so heartbroken, she wore black for the next 40 years. She didn't just grieve, she made grief a dress code. She turned her sadness into a trend that the whole world followed. We still do that today. We see a person in a black suit or a black dress at a cemetery, and we know the story without them saying a word. That's a Victorian habit we just couldn't shake. It's been over 100 years, and we're still wearing her mourning clothes. And it's not just the sad stuff. We still have that same obsession with what famous people are doing. Back then, if the Queen wore a specific type of lace or a certain shade of purple, every woman in London wanted it. They would scramble to find a cheap version just to feel like they were part of the club. Fast forward to now, a celebrity posts a single photo in a pair of sneakers and the brand's website crashes in 5 minutes. We call it influencer culture, like it's something new, but it's the same thing. The tools changed, but our brains didn't. We still want to look like the people at the top, even if it costs too much or feels a bit ridiculous. Now, sure, we did drop the really crazy habits. We stopped grinding up Egyptian mummies and eating them as medicine. Yes, they actually did that. They thought ancient dust would cure a stomachache or a headache. We stopped doing that for obvious reasons. We also stopped putting lead in our face powder because, turns out, people don't like it when their skin falls off. We figured out that breathing in green wallpaper fumes wasn't just bad luck, it was a death sentence. We got smarter about the chemistry, but we didn't necessarily get smarter about ourselves. It's easy for us to look back at them and laugh. We sit here in our air-conditioned rooms and think, man, those people were totally out of their minds. Who eats a mummy?
Who wears a dress that could literally poison them through their skin? We feel pretty superior. We have science. We have warning labels. We have laws that keep the poison out of our clothes. But here's the catch. History moves in a circle. Every single generation thinks they finally have it all figured out. They think they're the ones who finally reached the peak of being smart and safe. And every single generation is wrong about something huge. Right now, you're probably wearing something or eating something or doing something that will make a person in the year 2124 stop in their tracks. Maybe it's the way we use plastic for everything. Maybe it's the way we stare at glowing screens for 10 hours a day. We look at the Victorians like they were characters in a horror movie.
We see the photos of dead relatives and the arsenic dresses, and we think they were a different species. But they weren't. They were just people. They were trying to look good. They were trying to be modern. They were trying to keep up with their friends, just like you, just like me. So take a good look in the mirror. Enjoy your style, because I guarantee you, a century from now, someone is going to be telling our story, and they're going to be wondering how we ever survived the things we thought were normal.